Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart.
Tonight, the conclusion of the tragic story of Glen Davis, the multi-millionaire and passionate supporter of the environment who was murdered in a plot to gain inheritance.
Davis was found shot in the torso Friday after a lunch meeting with a World Wildlife Fund colleague.
Police seem certain of one thing: Davis's murder wasn't a random event.
I can't comment to motive, but he was definitely selected for this crime.
We thought about things like infidelity, jealous husband, or a family member.
Davis may have been targeted because of the $100 million fortune he inherited from his father.
Police were following up on a previous attack against Davis, just a year and a half before his murder.
Tyler provided information to us that outlined the attempt murder using the baseball bat that he participated in. He outlined basically the motivation for it, that it was in relation to the business that was owned by Marshall Ross.
The relationship between Marshall and Glen was described as father and son. Glen had no children.
Based on what they'd learned, police began to pick off the suspects one by one.
Nearly 2 years after Canada's preeminent wilderness philanthropist was shot to death in an underground garage, police have made 3 arrests in the case of 66-year-old Glen Davis. Investigators have now charged Evgeny Vorobyov and Dmitry Kozarin, both 30, from Richmond Hill, along with a third accused, 37-year-old Marshall Ross.
Here now is Mark Carcasole with part 2 of The Murder of the Millionaire Philanthropist.
With Marshall Ross now behind bars, accused of first-degree murder in the death of his godfather, Glen Davis, the man who treated him like a son, those who knew Marshall personally, professionally, or even peripherally wondered how he could have done it and why.
Well, I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it for quite a while. It's still, I mean, it's very, very hard to reconcile the lovely young man I knew, whom I trusted with my daughter sitting around a campfire. I remember the first time Glen introduced him to me was right after Marshall had opened an office within Glen's office area, which was in an old home, a beautiful, beautiful estate kind of home at the end of a cul-de-sac in Toronto. I was having lunch with Glen to talk over some business issues for Sierra Club, and he invited Marshall to join us for lunch. The relationship was not actually of uncle and nephew, but that's the way Glen treated him, took him under his wing and said, you know, now Marshall has his office here and he's doing some interesting things. After that, it became very normal to see Marshall when I'd come to Toronto to see Glen. How do you reconcile that bright, charming, lovely young man with this cold-blooded killer?
On Marshall's part, there was a sense of entitlement to some of the estate, unwarranted, but nonetheless, he had these ideas that he should be a richer man than he was.
When I met Marshall Ross, I was the co-founder of a health startup, and we were growing. We needed money, we needed manpower. I had just been fortunate enough to have an article done about me in the Financial Post. And at the end of the phone was a fellow named Marshall Ross who represented an investor. And he was interested in helping our company out. And that was way back in 2000.
Kathy Kastner remembers Ross as a friend and valuable partner, intelligent, easy to get along with, adaptable.
In addition to bringing in an investment, he also would introduce us to high-level people that we never would have gotten into contact before. Most importantly, he was able to roll with the disparate personalities in our company. He had the ability to defray any tension. He had sort of a way about him that was a little chuckle at the beginning of anything that looked like it might get tense. He'd go, well, I think that we can work that out, or, well, I think that that's not such a big deal. So he brought to us a good sense of humor, smarts about so many things, And he was always willing to help, not just in the office as our chief financial officer, but if we need furniture moved, he was right there. He'd say, "You want muscle? I'll bring you muscle." He was just an all-round terrific addition to our company.
The same could not be said for Ross's other endeavors, however. He may have been able to help others invest their money, but he was not very good with his own, a trait police picked up on 2 years earlier during their initial investigation into the Glen Davis murder.
It was apparent that Marshall Ross, from the forensic audit, was provided a large sum of money by Glen to start up a business that wasn't doing very well. Glen had put Marshall up on Versailles in his office building and gave him clerical staff and free office space and phone and all those things, plus access to $3 million.
The contracting business Glen helped Marshall start up proved to be a failure and a personal piggy bank for Ross.
Marshall Ross had been indebted to Glen for almost $3 million. And given that Glen had made other people whole for a whole lot more money in other business dealings, we didn't see this at the time as a motive. And when we did question Marshall Ross about it, he was able to provide us with documents that had a payment schedule, a number of projects in the pipeline there that, would have brought him out of those arrears and paid it off. Later on in the investigation, we discovered that much of what he told us that day was not, in fact, true. Marshall, had a number of properties. Only a few of them were actual projects. The rest were shells that would mask the vast amounts of money that Marshall was just taking from Glen to fund his lavish lifestyle, including renting 2 villas in France and being there for a month and a half. Glen trusted Marshall, asked very few questions, despite the fact that those around Glen were asking a number of questions about Marshall. How can Marshall run a business and be out of the country, like during prime season for this kind of work? But Glen continued to dismiss, in fact, discouraged his accountant from going to any of the projects. Marshall's Marshall. Marshall will figure it out. Marshall's working through this. Marshall's new at this. And he really, really trusted Marshall.
But that trust would only last so long. After a time, police say Glen began pressing Marshall.
When he would have his one-on-ones with Marshall, including the accountant, there's a number of questions that Glen asked of Marshall, including his business plan, his philosophy, where Marshall was suddenly requesting large sums of money to buy homes, when the original business plan was just to renovate customers' homes and make money that way. And Glen felt that these big expenditures on buying property would exhaust all the funds that Glen had made available to Marshall, and began to question. So Marshall was feeling a lot of pressure. He realized that Glen was starting to catch on and asking a number of questions, increasingly difficult questions. Marshall would suggest that he made an accounting error, and this should have been in this column, and that project didn't go, and I should have removed that, and began to play dumb really with Glen and suggest that he didn't understand how a spreadsheet would work.
And so, with Ross's business plans tanking, his debts rising, and Glen's suspicion growing, Marshall Ross launched his murder plot, enlisting his main contractor, Dimitri Kosarin, to help out.
Dimitri was the proprietor of DK Homes, which was a renovation company. Marshall Ross had a company called Rossshire Enterprises, and so Marshall was the front man of this operation, where he's the polished guy. He would go in, meet homeowners or buy properties, and then try to get the contracts using Dimitri. So they had made lots of money together, and so Dimitri felt very, very indebted to Marshall and realized that Marshall was a gravy train. And Marshall had painted this great picture of how the good times will continue to roll as long as Glen's out of the picture. Dimitri, being told by Marshall that Glen was beginning to ask questions and that this may not continue much longer if Glen's not taken out, approaches Tyler Colley.
Just like that, the godson who sang Davis's praises in his eulogy, who placed his ashes in the grave, proceeded to mastermind the killing of the man he called uncle.
Marshall felt that Glen was giving away all of his money to these environmental causes, money that was rightfully his. And because Marshall was like a son and Glen had no children, that Marshall would inherit the company and be able to decide where all that money goes. The fact is, Glen's will was specific and didn't include Marshall. For some reason, Glen made the decision to take Marshall out without telling Marshall. So Marshall felt like he was going to inherit a lot of money. More importantly, wipe out the debt that he had accumulated.
Ross didn't know he'd been removed from Glen's will. So to secure the money he felt like he would receive, he planned to have his own godfather killed.
Coming up, as they build their case against Marshall Ross, police piece together what happened during the first attempt on Glen Davis's life and why it took 2 tries to kill him. Welcome back. Knowing Marshall Ross didn't actually pull the trigger, prosecutors need a strong case to show who did and how it all traces back to the alleged mastermind. We now return to Mark Carcasole with the murder of the millionaire philanthropist.
The first attempt on Glen Davis's life came in the form of a severe beating just days before Christmas 2005. Roofer Tyler Cawley would later admit to police that he and an accomplice were paid to do it by Marshall Ross through Dimitri Kosarin. Rather than buy a gun as directed, they kept the money and instead used an aluminum baseball bat filled with dog kibble.
Tyler Cawley and his accomplice pulled ahead of Glen Davis and beat him here. Glen followed in and parked on the driveway on this side of the hedges here. Tyler and his accomplice walked through these hedges, and it is in this area here that Glen is struck from behind and knocked down to the ground. And the beating continues, and Glen actually puts his arm and leg up in order to defend himself. He suffered significant injuries, including fractures that required several surgeries. Just beyond those bushes there were workers, roofers, who were doing work on that home. They heard Glen's cries for help. They shouted down, which caused Tyler and his co-accused to get back in the car.
When that plan failed, Marshall tried again.
Marshall, in the interceding 18 months since the beating, had been looking for somebody to kill Glen, and had actually met with Dimitri at the parking lot again at the Home Depot. In an angry tone, had suggested that if you're not going to do this, then give me the gun and I'll go do it myself, and no one else will benefit from this except for me, adding pressure to Dimitri.
The second time around, Dimitri enlisted more of his contractors, including Evgeny Eugene Vorobyov.
So Marshall had conned Dimitri essentially and promised him that the money would continue to flow with little or no work by Dimitri. If Glen was just out of the picture, he was going to create a position within Rushar Company and where Dimitri would receive a salary for life essentially, and that he would do the same thing for Eugene if Eugene had just carried out the murder. And so it was during those conversations that Eugene's name first was raised between the two of them. Eugene also had access to firearms, and this was an important part because Marshall insisted that this time Glen could not survive the second attempt.
The new plan also involved a man later identified as Vorobyov's getaway driver, Jesse Smith. Jesse Smith told the court he had no idea of Vorobyov's murderous intentions, but police say he knew exactly what he was getting into that day. Smith ultimately pled guilty to accessory after the fact and agreed to testify against his co-accused. He would later testify that on May 18, 2007, Vorobyov picked him up at a DK job site to take him to lunch, but they first stopped at an office building in Midtown where Vorobyov claimed he had to go to a meeting. They parked, and surveillance video shows Smith accompanying Vorobyov into the underground parking lot of that building.
This coincidentally occurs approximately 15 minutes after Glen Davis arrives in his SUV using that same door. So Glen drives in and you can see it's a white SUV with the personalized plate and the sticker.
The footage shows a moment that still makes Moreira shake his head to this day. A moment that may have helped them break this case much sooner. What could have been potential DNA evidence.
Just before entering, Evgeny Vorobyov removes a cigarette from his mouth and flicks it down onto the ground. This is potentially an important piece of evidence, but unfortunate for our investigation, a transient person happens to go by, sees a cigarette that's half finished, and picks it up and walks away with it. This is prior to the murder, prior to anything else happening, and it's intervening time.
That's your potential break, just being taken away?
Yeah, it was, when I first saw him walking in, I was very optimistic that this would be an important piece of evidence, but You just had to keep following the video, and regrettably, that's what happens. Those are the breaks that we come up against sometimes.
Unaware of all that, the door closes behind the men as they enter the garage, Smith joining Vorobyov, ostensibly to help him find the vehicle belonging to the person Vorobyov was supposed to meet. The white SUV they find belongs to Glen Davis. Surveillance footage eventually shows the men leaving the garage through the same door minutes later. They would go back to Vorobyov's vehicle, which he then asked Smith to drive around to the parking entrance on the other side of the building. Vorobyov would walk to the other side, caught on relatively clear video passing by the automatic front doors of a nearby pharmacy. While Smith waited in his car, Vorobyov would descend the ramp of that alternate parking entrance to his so-called meeting.
While in the underground parking lot, Vorobyov can be seen entering the P2 elevator lobby. He's looking at the status of the elevators, and he spends the rest of his time at this location.
Back at the scene 15 years later, now a staff superintendent, Moreira describes how Davis was ambushed as he came out of one of those elevators on the P2 level.
So Glen walked down in this direction here. His car was parked at the very end of this driveway here, where that pole is on the wall. We believe that Evgeny Vorobyov was lying in wait in behind him here, and he wouldn't have been aware of Evgeny's presence. As Glen walks in this direction towards his car, he is alerted to Evgeny's presence, and we believe that it was at this time that Evgeny shot Glen Davis in the back. Glen had just arrived in this general location here, and he collapsed as a result of the very first shot. He had not made it to his car, which was some distance away here. Evgeny walked up to where Glen was lying, and from the testimony of Jesse Smith, we believe Glen begged for his life, and that is when Evgeny fired another round into Glen's chest. Glen never got up from this point here and essentially bled out. He was found by people in the building a few minutes after the shooting happened, but by the time he was transported to the hospital, he had succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced deceased.
There were no cameras set up in the actual location where Davis was murdered, so Vorobyov was able to not only commit cold-blooded murder, but to get away without suspicion.
After Glen was shot the second time, Evgeny Vorobyov walked up this ramp here. When he reached the top of this ramp, there's a superintendent's office there with a big picture window, and that's where he is first spotted by the superintendent, who reports to us that he was initially coming out of his office after hearing the bang, believing that it was a collision at first and was coming to investigate. And that's where he saw Evgeny Vorobyov drop a paperclip near the bike rack and then walk up the ramp. The alligator clip, we later learned, was what Glen used to hold his money.
Worth noting, walked, didn't run, was in no rush.
Yeah, there's nothing remarkable about his movements there. He was very, very calm, drawing no attention to himself, and calmly walked by. In fact, the superintendent who heard the bang did not even consider that it could have been gunshots or that this person was involved. Just simply saw somebody walking in the underground, as is the case here. It happens all the time. He drew no attention to himself and calmly walked out of here as chaos was breaking down downstairs as Glen's body was being found.
Back at street level, Vorobyov would go on to meet Smith, who'd been waiting for him in his vehicle for about an hour. There, Vorobyov informed Smith that he had shot and killed Glen Davis. Smith then drove with Vorobyov to Port Perry, a little less than 2 hours northeast of Toronto, stopping along the way to buy scissors to cut up and dispose of Davis's ID cards and toss the gun into a roadside pond. The men spent the night gambling at a casino in Port Perry and eating dinner at a local restaurant.
Jesse traveled to Cuba with the fellas. Jesse, married a Cuban girl who was related to one of the other guy's wives. He knew very well what he was involved in. Now, Jesse Smith was low on the totem pole, but he was good friends with Vorobyov and Kosarin. He knew what he was involved in.
Police wiretaps and surveillance material also helped fill in many blanks in the aftermath of Glen Davis's murder, capturing Marshall Ross and his henchmen in various stages of trying to cover their tracks. In one case, arranging to send gunman Evgeny Eugene Vorobyov out of country with some money to lay low for a while.
I think that's for Eugene, just get him out. Just get him for I want to talk to my dad. They're gonna whatever else, so I think you should go soon. Oh, okay, no problem.
There was his same laughter that dissipated any tension. Who is this man? Who is this guy that I had such good feelings about, had such good faith in, who is so helpful? I was absolutely gobsmacked.
But see, it's tough because I don't have like, $5,000 to give him a month. He's got to go get a job too. Like he's got to help us. That's why he has to. Go where? Anywhere. He got over here. I don't want him here.
The conversations show that the accused were feeling the pressure, the desperation building as Ross and Carcasole tried to get their story straight.
Pretty stressful right now. So mad about it. I've never been stressful like this in my fucking life. Disaster.
But also the blatant confidence Marshall Ross had that they would all get away with it.
The beautiful part about it is there's absolutely no motive on it. There's no reason why we would have done it. There's no, it doesn't look like there's any reason.
After the break, even faced with the strong evidence against him, Marshall Ross is still convinced he'll get away with it. Welcome back. As police build an insurmountable case against the accused, Marshall Ross maintains his innocence. We now return to the murder of the millionaire philanthropist.
I found Marshall very arrogant. You could see that he thought he was above others. Almost like he felt that he was getting away with it by his answers, that, oh, I don't know anything about that. Why would I have a motive? Like denying everything. Right up until when he walked in the police station, I think he felt confident he was going to be walking out of there and going to Mexico on Monday.
Marshall really believed that he was the smartest guy in the room. We would use that against Marshall, and we would put a lot of pressure on Marshall by not pressuring him at all. And we would ask him questions that didn't seem to be connected to anything, but we knew connected to certain spots. So we didn't go in for the kill. It was a series of meetings that we had with him where we were able to get him to commit to a number of things which painted him into a corner.
Despite police insisting they had Marshall Ross painted into a corner, when they'd call him into their 32 Division detachment, they would find him doing his best to act unfazed.
Marshall Ross arrives at 32 Division for his interview that I had told him we needed to speak to him. He comes in very willing. At that point, I tell him that, we have some new information that's come through on the investigation. And right away at this point, as I said, we now have reasonable probable grounds to believe he was involved in the murder. At that point in time, I tell him he's under arrest for first-degree murder of Glen Davis. You can see the look on his face. It was just blank. I don't think he was expecting it. His head kind of just dropped, and he's shaking his head in disbelief, really. So from there, he's then turned over to Peter Morera and Mike Barsky, who then conduct a formal interview with Marshall Ross in an interview setting, now as an accused.
He was very stoic. He's very almost rehearsed in the way he was. And he stared through us. He was very cavalier in his attitude, as if I've done nothing wrong. I don't know why you would even have me in here. You've really got to be kidding. We played audio tapes for him.
I'm broke. I don't even have money to put in the gas.
Well, Eugene, I don't have anything. I don't get money until, at this point, it's probably April or May that I get the big chunk of cash.
Not a sense that anything was wrong. At least with the others, you could see a reaction in their eye, or a deep breath, or a movement of the body, which suggested that they knew what they'd done. They took responsibility for it, but they weren't going to talk about it, which is fine. But they also knew that we had all the facts and more.
The men responsible for plotting and executing the murder of Glen Davis would all be brought to justice in court. Evgeny Eugene Vorobyov would be found guilty of first-degree murder. Dmitry Kosarin's first trial ended with a hung jury. He was convicted of first-degree murder the second time around.
It's been a long ordeal. Tomorrow is in fact the 6th anniversary of the first attempt on Glen's life. Glen never knew, never suspected who was behind it, and he was struck down very tragically.
Before all that, Marshall Ross pleaded guilty to first-degree murder,
which is a rare occurrence in Canadian law.
I think once he saw the overwhelming evidence that we compiled in this investigation, there was no wiggle room. Like, there's no deniability with all the other information that we brought forward and all the other information that we accumulated over this investigation. It was quite a task to get this information and to bring it all together with all the bumps and things that happened along the way in the investigation. It was successful in that way that we were able to accumulate enough information and evidence that there were guilty pleas as a result of this.
Despite that guilty plea in court, behind bars, Marshall Ross would continue to claim innocence.
Despite the agreed statement of facts, everything you heard him say on the wiretaps, and the fact that he's just pleading guilty, still kind of made it seem, though, as if he didn't really do it. He was pleading guilty for a reason.
I'm not a psychologist, but I think Marshall Ross is a narcissist. I arrive at that conclusion only because we sat through 2 days of an agreed statement of fact where his lawyer was repeatedly asking at every fact that the Crown read in and whether it was correct, and he agreed to it. Marshall Ross didn't have any support in the courtroom at all over those 2 days. There was nobody from his family there. And I think that's by design. I think Marshall Ross still wants to play himself as the martyr. From the information that I have received, there is still some doubt among some in his family as to what the level of his involvement is. It's been suggested to me through some people that connected to Marshall that Marshall was pressured into this by the Russians. I only pled guilty to protect the rest of the family. He's a very noble man. What they failed to understand or to ever listen to is the wiretap interceptions that clearly makes that just nonsense. Marshall continues to try to play the victim and be the martyr.
It seemed he would tell anyone who'd listen that Glen's killing was not his doing.
When I saw Marshall in jail, he alluded to something about Russians, although this was in jail he was talking about. I can only wildly speculate, knowing what I do and don't know, that there was another side to the story, that there's a worry about Russian retribution. It is so far from my realm of reality that I can only shake my head and go, so many things that I don't know about.
We reached Ross's mother, who is now remarried and goes by the name Marcia Brooks, by telephone. She refused a full interview and has largely removed herself from the situation. But she doesn't disavow her son's claims either.
As you rightly know, there's 2 sides to every story. And, but I'm not prepared to talk to you. And there definitely are many sides to this story, unfortunately.
If the Russian mafia was involved in this, Marshall Ross would no longer be in jail. He'd be in a box right now. It just goes to show how fraudulent and conniving Marshall Ross was. He had convinced his family that he was a dupe in all of this. He was, being set up. And it goes to show the magnitude of how long he'd been doing that as well, because his family truly believed it. Coincidentally, none of his family was there the day he was read the facts in issue by Hank Goody, the day he admitted to every one of those facts in open court. Not one family member was there to hear that. So he could allow that facade and that fraud to continue on. Today they still believe he's done nothing wrong. He had a man murdered because he thought he would take over the ability to have signing authority for the Glen Davis Corporation. He was a fraud. He lied about his education. He lied about the things he'd done. He stole from Glen Davis and Mary Alice. He squandered $3 million and lived the lifestyle that we could only dream of. And now he wants his family to believe, poor me, shame on him.
Unfortunately, there'd be no closure for Glen Davis's family and friends. Marshall Ross would end up back in court again in the years to come, once to right wrongs from the past, and once to face a new set of allegations.
Coming up. Although he's behind bars, Marshall Ross is accused in yet another plot to murder those close to the family business. That's after the break. Welcome back. Now behind bars for the first-degree murder of his godfather, shocking new allegations against Marshall Ross are revealed. We now return to Mark Carcasole with the murder of the millionaire philanthropist.
In custody at the Bath Institution west of Kingston, Ontario, Marshall Ross would end up embroiled in a civil case with the family business, N.M. Davis Corporation, which sued him to recoup the roughly $3 million he owed them. In 2012, Ross was ultimately ordered to pay that money back. It was the debt that just wouldn't go away, and it was the alleged catalyst for a series of similar allegations Ross faced in 2020.
So Joe's a fellow murderer who indicated that Ross wanted him to hire people to kill Glen Davis's widow, Mary Alice Davis, the lawyer, Peter Quinn, the general manager of the company, Keith Jones, and an accountant. And he would arrange payment.
Joe told police about the alleged plot, and investigators claimed that Ross also gave Joe his ex-wife Eva Wauer's phone number so she could be contacted by a third party to get a fake passport.
You still think he's innocent?
Wauer was called as a defense witness in the case, which went to trial for 2 weeks in the summer of 2022.
Marshall's ex-wife knew nothing about this plot. The police put a room probe in a family visit facility. There was not a word that was revealed between them about this plot. Several months later, shortly before Marshall was arrested, Eva Wauer was approached by an undercover police officer posing as being a confederate of Joe to try to get a passport off Eva, try to enlist her in this plot, and Eva was completely baffled by it. She didn't know what on earth was going on.
Ross's lawyer, Peter Zadek, says the allegations against his client were far-fetched and unrealistic.
For one thing, the other inmate was to put up $100,000 of his own money, and then Ross was to pay it back when supposedly he was able to escape to Belize. Also, there had to be 4 people killed simultaneously. And then there were all sorts of crucial details that weren't worked out, like who the killers would be, how they would be paid, how they would get away. And on top of this, all of this had to be choreographed with Marshall Ross's transfer to a minimum security penitentiary from which he could escape.
Central to the Crown's case was a map drawn up by Ross and given to Joe, which he then passed on to investigators.
Sort of bizarre document that had the names of the supposed 4 targets in the murder plot, together with some details about where they lived and how they could be found and who knew who.
While the judge would describe the document as troubling and supportive of the Crown's murder map theory, he also found it wasn't the only possible explanation, hence a reasonable doubt. He also wasn't convinced Ross would want the 4 people in question dead to avoid his debt to N.M. Davis Corporation.
Marshall would have known from his previous case that the death of these people would not impede the lawsuit going forward.
In the end, the charges would not stick. Marshall Ross, who did not testify during the trial, was acquitted.
In the law, you can't have 2 unformed offenses linking to each other, because Marshall Ross would be asking Joe, who's a fellow inmate who obviously can't do the killing himself, to hire someone or counsel someone else to do an offense. So that in law is untenable. You can't ask someone who's incapable of doing the crime to get someone else to do it. And also Joe had major credibility issues because he was known as a liar. He would say he was connected to everybody from the Montreal Mafia to the Triads on the West Coast.
The ruling was a major blow to those close to Glen and Mary Alice Davis, some of whom were said to be targets in the alleged plot. Family friend Keith Jones let his feelings be known in the courtroom, directly to Ross after the acquittal was read.
I believe I said, "You're still a murderer, you scumbag, and I hope you rot in hell." We've been through 17 years of hell with this man. We've all suffered greatly, emotionally, mentally, the anguish that we have suffered. Certainly very disappointed in the verdict today. I think that most people would have saw the evidence, especially that map, and would have agreed that there certainly was intent.
I'm convinced that he did do what he said, but the judge couldn't get past a reasonable doubt. It does sound a little bizarre, but then so was the original murder, that the debt was going to go away because he murdered Glen. I mean, so what's the difference between that and now?
The detectives who helped put Ross behind bars in the first place were also paying close attention and have some strong feelings about the verdict and the man acquitted.
He wasn't found innocent. He was found not guilty based on the evidence that was presented. That doesn't mean you didn't do it or you weren't planning it. That simply means there wasn't enough evidence to convict that person. To me, as far-fetched as it may be to say that, you could orchestrate that, in his mind, he still had the belief that he could do it because he's Marshall Ross.
In his acquittal ruling, Justice Graham Mew also made mention of Marshall Ross's chances at parole. Ross would be eligible for the so-called faint hope clause, a legal loophole repealed on December 2nd, 2011, but still an option for those, like Ross, convicted of crimes committed before that day.
After 15 years, he could apply to the court to get his parole ineligibility reduced from 25 years to something less. One aspect of the judge's ruling is it didn't make a lot of sense that he would engineer 4 murders if in fact he had some prospect of getting released in just a couple more years. He's been a model inmate. He's had no institutional infractions. He's taught other inmates. He's earned a transfer from a maximum security to a medium security. And he was on a positive trajectory when 2 years ago he was charged with this new charge of counseling 4 murders.
Can he apply for it? Yeah, it sounds like he can. Will he? Undoubtedly. In the things that I've read, though, I've yet to see somebody convicted of first-degree murder who pled to first-degree murder who was successful in a faint hope clause.
If there's a parole hearing in Marshall Ross's future, those closest to Glen Davis say they'll have their victim impact statements ready, opposing Ross's chances of getting even a second of freedom.
As long as I'm alive, yes, I'll be there.
For me, this man should just die in prison. I would be happy with that if he just died in prison.
Coming up, when we come back, with this second alleged plot behind them, Glen Davis's family and friends do their best to move on. After living through a second trial, family and friends of Glen Davis reflect on his legacy of protecting the environment. Here now is the conclusion of the murder of the millionaire philanthropist.
Clearly, the most heartbroken, yet publicly quiet about the death of Glen Davis is his wife, Mary Alice. She lost the love of her life that day. In some ways, her total opposite, but in every way, her other half, her everything.
He would take my entire team from Sierra Club out for a breakfast in Ottawa just before Christmas, and we would go to Mountain Equipment Co-op, and Glen would just stand at the end of the checkout and he'd give people a rough idea of what they could spend. Sort of say, well, if you're not spending about $400 a person, you're not spending enough. Sometimes his wife would get a phone call and they'd say, the credit card company would say, there's some unusual charges. And she would say, oh, where? And they'd say, Mountain Equipment Co-op. She'd say, no, that's not unusual. If it was a jewelry store, I'd know there was a problem, but no, that's my husband. They had an adorable marriage. They loved each other very, very much. And I don't know how Mary Alice has managed since 2007. It's just been devastating for everyone.
While some of Davis's good friends did speak to us for this story, many others chose not to. Mary Alice Davis also opted not to take part. Like her late husband, she lives a quiet, unassuming life, not inclined to give interviews. Now a superintendent with Toronto Police, Michael Barsky, remains very close with Mrs. Davis and her family.
She's such a nice lady, such an honest, humble woman. She's had her life ripped away from her. She met Glen in university. They married, they had what would otherwise be a beautiful relationship, but they're very private people. They don't want their 15 minutes of fame. She wants to be able to mourn the loss of a man she loved. Sadly, Marshall won't allow her to just to mourn in peace and just go on with her life. He continues to be knocking at the back door.
But as the old saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished, and it's the suddenness and senselessness of his death that makes his loss so painful to Glen's family and friends.
Marshall's misunderstandings of what he had to inherit that led to the greed, that led to the idea. I know he owed Glen money. Glen would never have cared. He would have written it off. He wouldn't have pursued it. He wouldn't have said, well, you messed up that business deal, now you owe me. He wouldn't have done that. I mean, that's the thing, is that beyond the cruelty and the sinfulness of it all was the stupidity that made a family member think there would be a solution to his own greed and problems and debt by killing someone who would have given him the shirt off his back if he'd asked for it.
It's been very hard on all of us, particularly on Mary Alice. This whole 2 decades of this have been very hard on Mary Alice. But hopefully we can move on now, and we know that Marshall is still in jail, and hopefully he will stay there for a long, long time.
Well, we're going to live our lives well. That's what we're going to do. He's in a box, and we're up at our cottage in Muskoka. And the strength of my family, my wife and my daughters, we get through this too. We get through this too, absolutely.
Glen Davis's impact on nature and the environment was huge. According to World Wildlife Fund Canada, who provided us with the following statement, his efforts literally changed the map of Canada. Quote, Glen Davis had a deep and long-standing love for nature and wildlife, and his dedication helped change the conservation landscape in Canada. His support of WWF Canada's Endangered Spaces campaign between 1989 and 2000 resulted in the establishment of more than 1,000 new nature reserves, parks, and wilderness areas, doubling the amount of protected lands and waters in Canada.
Before Glen came along, I think the proportion of Canada's landscape that was protected, either in parks or other types of protected areas like national wildlife areas, etc., I think was around 5% or something like that. And World Wildlife Fund set a goal, let's increase that to 11%, which was the international standard for that time. And we came very close to achieving that. Glen was involved in funding the people who were, putting the pressure on the politicians and working with local communities to show them that establishing a national park or protected area, it's good for the economy, it's good for the land, and it's good for Canada overall.
Despite helping fund so many of them, there are no conservation areas in Canada named after Glen Davis. Aside from a small street in Toronto's Beaches neighborhood, no structures bear his name. Glen's legacy speaks for itself. It has to, because he wasn't one to do it himself.
Glen Davis was not somebody you forget, that's for sure. And Glen was an extraordinary human being, very generous.
Glen's been dead for 15 years now. But, I have to say, no new Glen Davis has emerged in that time.
He was the single largest individual donor to conservation in this country. And his absence, his killing, I loved him as a friend, so I'm emotional about it. But looking at it in terms of his contribution to protecting wilderness in this country, he is quite overlooked because he didn't claim credit.
He was a great Canadian, and those of us who had the privilege of working with him will miss him tremendously. We still miss him. As I say, I think about him every day because this continues to be my life. My life is his life. We travel, we're on the same path still. I often think, well, what would Glen be doing right now?
On the 10th anniversary of his death, World Wildlife Fund Canada, together with Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, created the Glen Davis Conservation Leadership Prize, a $10,000 award given to individuals making tangible differences in protecting the country's environment.
I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat.
Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast, now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.